Good morning, students. So today is our first presentation in terms of the content. So it's LSK3701, Life Skills, Science and Technology Teaching in the Foundation Phase. This is your presentation and Learning Unit 1, and I am your lecturer, Mrs. Ayehsha Carrim, and you can email me on ecareer1@unisa.ac.za for any additional support. So the purpose of this presentation is to brief you with an introduction to how we become familiar with the content of Learning Unit 1. So Learning Unit 1 is the nature of science and science learning. We will start with an introduction, scientific literacy, the nature of science, learning science through inquiry, scientific concepts, how concepts develop, conceptual change in the learning of science, using the concept of cloud as an example, scientific understanding of water, liquid, and water vapor, language and learning of science. Presentation is basically to give you a brief introduction to help you become familiar with the content of Learning Unit 1. This is just a snip from your study guide on the content that this Learning Unit 1 contains. So Learning Unit 1 has basically outcomes that need to be achieved. And after you completed this learning unit, you should be able to analyze problem-based scenarios in the environment and society, by demonstrating the development of scientific literacy in your learners, communicate ideas and opinions about the nature of science and scientific literacy by means of appropriate academic and professional discourse, and identify and interpret scientific concepts in science investigations. You also need to cite appropriate examples to demonstrate your understanding of scientific concepts and actually also apply your content to different themes. So identify, interpret, and analyze children's thinking processes in relation to science. So let's look at the first content that you will basically see in your study guide, which is let's understand scientific literacy. So you need to ask yourself these questions when trying to get yourself to read through the study guide. What is the natural science learning area curriculum of South Africa aimed at? So remember, it's aimed at promoting learner scientific literacy. So scientific literacy also is something that is interrelated features, and that is when you will consider the 4 interrelated features that are referred to by scientific literacy, which is your scientific knowledge and the use of that knowledge to actually identify questions, to acquire new knowledge, to explain the scientific phenomena, and to basically draw evidence about conclusions that are related to science-related issues. There's also understanding the characteristic features of science as a form of human knowledge and inquiry, and basically being aware of how science and technology shape people's, material, intellectual, and cultural environments. And it's also the willingness to actually engage in science-related issues, and with the ideas of science as a constructive, concerned, and reflective citizen. This is very important that you interrelate these features when you, working with scientific literacy. So what does scientific literacy influence? Remember, it influences people's decisions about about personal and societal problems. If you, for example, you had to decide whether a nuclear power station should be built in your province, what would you say about it? And what would you do what would you base your argument on? How would you react if a landfill was to be built near your home? We need to consider all of these questions so that it also allows us to understand it from a personal and a societal point of view. So the overall aim of the science curriculum is to basically develop learners' scientific literacy, and overall understanding. There are 3 components that are distinguished to promote the aim of scientific literacy, and these are broken down into components so that it can be achievable, achievable within the curriculum and program, and it can be planned in that sense. So in order to promote the aim of scientific literacy, the 3 components are scientific knowledge and concepts, the scientific process skills, and the scientific attitudes. And why is this aim broken down into components? Like I said previously, so that you can achieve an understanding, within these 3 components. It's not easy to, to give the information on in one lesson. It's something that gradually needs to develop, especially in our younger learners. Okay, so there's another content area in this learning unit where you need to understand the nature of science. So remember also in this sense, you need to first get your understanding on what is your understanding of science, and why do you think it's important in your life and the lives of the people in your community. That's how you need to get your students thinking. What do they think the role of science is in their life? So now obviously when we're looking at young learners, we can bring up, what do you think a scientist does and what do they look like? Those are things that we need to first, bring into the classroom so that students can give their ideas about scientists, and, they can also show what a scientist looks like and what their ideas and about science is. And this will actually affect how you teach science and how they learn science in your class. So, what are the two main views that people hold about the nature of science? So, there are two main views that people hold about science, and there's a more traditional view, where that are held by some teachers, in that science is a subject and it has rules, it has laws and theories, and they need to be learned. And then, if you look at the more modern view, that science is a study of natural phenomena, as well as trying to understand the world and a way of thinking and acting. And only if you view science as a way of doing rather than an object to study, will you be motivated to teach science as a teacher, as a form of inquiry, and not just as a subject that involves the study of facts. And, it is true, learners. So how should you view science? So this is something that you need to consider when what is your view of science. So it is rather better to view science as a way of doing rather than an object, where you just give your students a lot of facts, a lot of rules, and they can't make sense of it. They are actually so young learners that they want to inquire, they want to understand and develop an understanding of the nature of science and become scientifically literate. So this is how they become scientifically literate, by inquiring and, giving them that opportunity. How can you use teaching approaches to develop the scientific literacy of children who are curious about the world? So remember, we need to create that opportunity for them to ask questions. They shouldn't be afraid of science. You could, for example, teach science through inquiry. There are other ways. So this is when you consider the STEAM approach. So what does STEAM stand for? STEAM is basically science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics. So teaching science by means of indigenous knowledge also, that's also important, and teaching science to play. And these are all part of the integration that you need to understand when going through this learning unit and this module as a whole. So how can you incorporate the STEAM approach to teach science in an integrated way? So remember, when it comes to the STEAM approach, it's very important that you understand the integration, how you can integrate scientific knowledge, in terms of involving imagination, creativity, creating a lot of opportunities in terms of learning science to art, to mathematics. There's so much that you can understand, but you need to go through this learning unit and also develop the understanding of the STEAM approach, to integrate different practices of science. So what is the nature of the practice of science, and what other ways can you encourage the practice of science? So this is also something that you're going to have to read about in terms of, the product of human inference, and, creating that way to socially and culturally embed science within the learning, and also creating that distinctions through observations and inferences, and creating a relationship between scientific theories and laws. In addition, there are various methods of investigation that you can consider, where current knowledge guides the investigations, and students can involve their assumptions. And this is a way where they can also show the differences between data and evidence. And communication also plays an important role in consistent arguments. And this is also very important that you need to understand within this learning unit. So now we move through learning science through inquiry. So these questions that I created is just so while you reading through the unit, you ask yourself these questions. Do you think science can be memorized? What makes the exploration of science enjoyable and supports the lifelong learning of science? What does inquiry-based approach develop, and what are the 5 functions served by science inquiry? And what do you understand by inquiry as a teaching approach? Why is it important to encourage learners to ask questions? So remember, too many teachers approach science as if it's a body of knowledge that anyone can simply memorize. However, there's a wealth of scientific knowledge, and more is being generated at every moment. So we don't know which facts will be the most important in learners' lives. Remember, every generation is different. So what we do know is that everyone will be faced with new problems, and they will attempt to solve these problems. So those people that are best at solving problems will be the most successful, within life. So attitudes and thinking in science are the same as those attitudes and thinking that enable people to solve everyday problems. So you need to consider, the development of thinking and reasoning within your learners, create that open-mindedness and makes them explore, science and make it enjoyable and supports the lifelong learning of science. So inquiry-based approach develops scientific thinking, and in terms of promoting the development of scientific concepts, developing how we know science, the nature of science, and develop skills and make our students independent, in terms of inquiry while inquiring about the natural world. So when you're looking at inquiry, please understand that this teaching approach, it's basically opposite uh, to approaches like the transmission approach, where you just expose information. This is constructivist in nature. So learning is a result of ongoing changes, in our mental framework as learners attempt to make meaning of their experiences. And it also encourages active learning in children, and it develops that attitude of curiosity, where they have something to look at, and develop a new perspective and to question why it is being observed. And if we encourage our students to question, to wonder, to ask why, to become cautious about accepting things at face value. So the inquiry approach is basically based on asking questions, observation, allowing learners to give their own explanations, encourage them to explore new situations in objective and open-minded way. So it's very important that you consider this as well. But let's go to scientific concepts now. When you're going through this section, ask yourself, what are concepts? Why is it important to develop scientific concepts in foundation phase? What are the 3 components of a concept described by Leto in 2014? Reflect on these 3 components and use examples to basically help learners develop their own understanding of a concept using these 3 components. Remember, you would have to apply these 3 components to different themes. So what must teachers do to develop scientific concepts? So remember, when we're looking at a concept, it's something that is constructed in our brains. So also, if you are still very uncertain, that is fine. The idea of how an activity in the brain can lead to learning it's rather complex and confusing, especially when it comes to our young learners. For now, it is important that you know that connections are made in the brain to basically lead to learning. So where concepts are these basic units of knowledge, and it allows our students to organize and categorize information. And when they're able to organize and categorize information, it plays an important role in the process by which scientific concepts are developed in the brain. So we need to consider the various ideas about what concepts are exactly, and also maybe describe them in different components. So there are different types of concepts that build different bodies of knowledge. And if you look at this model, basically these concepts described by Leto, you get your concept X. So if you're talking about a bird, then you look at prototype of X. So what would be a prototype of X? I think students usually consider a chicken or whatever it is. And examples of birds, we'll say pigeons, doves, and hawks. And then the theory of birds, this is where we develop the theory of birds. So we basically tell them that the birds have 2 legs, or they also can bring it forth in the classroom, 2 legs, 2 wings, they have feathers, they can fly. So this is how we make them categorize and organize information in their mind so that it helps them with the learning and creating that connections. If learners are not taught to memorize facts, then it becomes easier for them to to compare things within an activity, and it's actually a build up, and while they're making connections in their brain, so they can actually develop a theory about a concept that it will be remembered much more or more than just giving out facts that cannot be used to solve problems. So one example of problem solving with respect to the topic of birds is when children are given a worksheet. If you ask them to name the animals on the worksheet and to decide if they're birds or not, children will use the concept of a bird to solve that problem, and they may rely on their knowledge of examples of birds. So just remember, what they really should do is organize the animals into groups according to their theory of birds. So this is where you can ask questions like, is it an animal that has two legs, it has two wings, feathers, claws, a beak, and can it fly? So remember this when you applying to the content of these components. Let's go on to the next slide. So this is how concepts develop. So also, again, I want you to ask yourself questions like, from when do children develop their own understanding of the world? Why is young learners' ideas of the world described as naive? Why is it important for teachers to consider learners' understanding of the world and of the scientific concepts before they teach? What examples can you describe of how children have a naive concept about scientific phenomena? And also consider examples about how you can plan and present an inquiry-based learning activity to develop, your learner's understanding of a specific scientific phenomena. And also, how does scientific development occur? So when it comes to the naive understanding and giving them, exploring the scientific understanding, that's where conceptual change develops. So remember, from birth, we develop a certain understanding of the world around us. So how the world works is that this is basically our own scientific understanding of the world. And if you look at theorists like Piaget, who explain how concept development happens in stages, and that he called the sensory motor, the pre-operational, the concrete operational, and the formal and operational stages. So young learners have basically ideas about how the world works, and this is what they bring to the classroom, where teachers need to actually develop a more scientific understanding of the concepts that they already may have. So it is important that teachers know what learners' understanding of a scientific concept is before they actually teach it. And remember, some of our learners have naive concepts about scientific phenomena. Example, using clouds. Young learners may think that clouds are like cotton wool. It's difficult for our young learners to understand that clouds are made up of these tiny water droplets. And if you need to teach the water cycle, in particular, when it comes to rain, remember, you must know what learners already understand about clouds. And this is how you can base your, plan your inquiry-based learning activity. So this is basically how they'll develop their understanding of the water cycle from a naive understanding to a more scientific understanding. Let's go to the next slide. So this is conceptual change in the learning of science. So there's quite a bit of information that you need to read up on. In terms of what is Carey's 2009 description of the process of conceptual change. They see conceptual change, she sees conceptual change as something that happens to bootstrapping activities. So you need to understand what bootstrapping is. It's basically, you should have an understanding of the word already, but if you don't, the word booting is basically something that refers to the process of starting, just say, for example, a computer. In a computer talk, a bootstrap is a program that allows a sequence of programs to load in order to initiate the operating system of a computer. So in other words, let's look at bootstrapping from a teacher's point of view, where a small amount of information given to students, and it needs, basically, this is what the students need in order for them to, start understanding, the content. So you basically, learning takes place by not giving all the information at once. So you give it to them, you start giving the students information in small amounts of information, and they actually get linked together into the scientific concepts that they need to understand. So another explanation of bootstrapping is when when that English expression to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, which refers to, lifting yourself off the ground by pulling on one's bootstraps. So imagine you would lift your feet by pulling on your shoelaces. So in your imagination, you cannot lift your feet by yourself. You have to pull on your bootlaces to get to the next step. So it's hard work. It's almost impossible, sometimes if you're not given that information before. So this thing is supposed to demonstrate that getting out of a difficult situation by one's own effort is hard work. But using the word bootstrapping is to refer to conceptual change. It tells us that learners learn bits of information slowly through hard work. So it shows how connections are made in the brain, and it takes time for strong connections to be made. So consider this, when you're reading through this section. Let's look at language and the learning of science. So language and the learning of science is also something that you need to consider, because language plays a very important role in the learning of science concept. And this is because hands-on activities aid in the development of language and reading. So reading is developed because a learner who can discriminate, between differences between objects will be better able to discriminate or see differences between letters and therefore read words. So if you look at the curriculum, English is something that is spread throughout the curriculum, and it's something that you need to incorporate while teaching science as well. So consider these questions. Why does language play an important role in the learning of scientific concepts? Suggest types of language activities that can be incorporated into the teaching of science. And also consider what language activities for science, are guided by learning. And what are the benefits of which questioning technique? What are 3 language scenarios faced in the South African foundation-based classroom? And what is your understanding of the implications of the language that is used when scientific concepts are taught in a multilingual society? So these are all things that you need to consider. Remember, when doing an activity, you may tell your students to write down 5 words, find a science activity that they can make sentences or read a comprehension about, ask questions so that they understand the story about maybe a concept like wind. So if, for example, learners read a story about wind and have no experience of wind, then a story would not make sense to them. So as a teacher, you need to find several science activities about wind for young children on the internet, maybe. And if you do these inquiry-based learning activities with your learners, they will not only develop an understanding of what they have read, but also an understanding of the scientific concept wind by using language within the classroom teaching approach. So we hope that by doing the activities as well, you will understand how you can introduce scientific concepts, and how to use your questioning technique, and also give your students also a chance to explain their observations and make inferences about what they observe. And also, when you look at the words, we need to use the words learned in science, within the explanations, and this is how they will start understanding and making connections between scientific concepts and be able to actually give their own explanations. So remember, language activities for science learning are usually guided by teacher questioning, and it creates improved comprehension, the improved ability for students to question and explain their observations. They will also you'll find an improvement in the way they predict certain things, whether it be in a scientific experiment. So learners who are taught by teachers who use good questioning skills create that curiosity within them, where they ask questions and they interrogate information. It's just basically a good way of teaching science within the foundation phase classroom. And when you look at the first additional language, you need to consider, what are the implications of language, especially in different schools, especially in the rural area or different contexts where children are not speaking English. Then you need to consider what other ways or using a multilingual, languages to, incorporate language into the classroom as well. Okay, so let's look at this slide here where we look at what is just basically the recall of information, in terms of the role of the working memory. in learning the language of science. So thinking or reasoning is controlled by the brain, remember. So you need to consider what areas of what basically is controlled by the brain. You know, the recall of information, the inhibition of ideas, the shifting between ideas. You need to look at the processes of executive functioning in science learning. If proper evidence is not given to change a learner's mind, then conceptual change will not happen. You know, where naive ideas are stopped, and basically the relevant knowledge are recalled to your working memory. And this is where conceptual change happens, you know, where learners can reason and explain their thinking and using ideas in their working memory. So remember, inquiry-based learning gives evidence for scientific ideas and understanding, and they're able to set shifting between ideas to reasoning and new scientific understanding. So read about this and understand it so that you're able to apply your knowledge. Let's go to the next slide. This is where we just looking at questions that you need to ask yourself. You know, why does the nature of science require learners to start a scientific inquiry from an understanding of concepts? And what is connected to scientific concepts in the brain called? What does learning actually involve? What is your understanding of why learners ask questions? You know, describe how causal reasoning helps students update his or her theory about a concept. What type of learning lends itself to exploration? Consider what does this type of learning result in, and how are the connections between the components of, you know, the concept of LITO that we described earlier. Also, what is your understanding of the executive functions? The three mechanisms working through the section should give you basically an understanding of how learners make a connection between teaching, and how you make a connection between teaching language and teaching science, and how would you describe that connection. So remember, this is all very important for you to, you know, to consider, because language plays a very important role in learning in the foundation phase. And you need to consider how your thinking about teaching science has changed. Have you made a connection between teaching language and teaching science? How would you describe that connection? You know, can you describe the connection between learning science and learning scientific words in a language that is not one's first language? So these are all very important that you need to consider when going through this unit and be able to basically apply your content in within your themes. So how should you, this is just a last bit that I wanted to add into this presentation. So how should you go about studying for your learning unit? So online learning is not easy. We all know that. And you should not underestimate the time and effort involved. So once you registered, please would you plan how you'll approach and complete this module. So remember, your work on each learning unit should involve skimming through the learning unit and draw your own basic mind map of the content that was described. This is basically just a brief description of the content that you will find in Learning Unit 1, and it's not enough to study for. So make your own summary of every unit. Do each activity and self-reflection activity within each learning unit. As you work, build up your study and exam preparation file. So this study file will not be assessed, but it will be extremely valuable tool for you in completing your assignments and to actually revise for the examination. What I can tell you again is that the study file is basically a folder that you create, you know, where you gather and compile additional and summarize information during the year, because this is a year course as you work through this learning material. And then your study file should comprise of answers to each activity, you know, mind maps or summary of each learning unit, your marked assignment, or at least a copy of your prior to submitting your assignment, so that you learn from your mistakes or learn if you did very well, your reflections on each learning unit, and applying the content to different themes using life skills CAPS document in the foundation phase. There's so many themes that you can apply the content to. Where relevant, please do read extra. There's a lot of YouTube videos that I've also added within the discussion forum, within the learning unit activities. You know, read on additional books and, you know, scientific journals. So that always adds to your general broader knowledge and your ability to apply the theme more easily. A new vocabulary of words according to the learning units, and compile and revise the contents of each learning unit to ensure that you achieve the learning outcomes for this module. Okay, so thanks for listening to this presentation. I wish you all the best, and Remember, start from the day you register so that it doesn't pile up on you and you're able to work through your assessments successfully. All the best, students.